Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the very ones who leave us to the mercy of the storm, proving that blood is not always thicker than the ice covering the ground. England, 1824. The wind howled around the stone corners of Braddock Hall like a living thing seeking entrance, a mournful, shrieking beast that rattled the loose window panes in their rotting frames. Inside the library, the air was only marginally warmer than the blizzard raging outside. The fireplace, vast enough to roast an ox, held only a pathetic pile of smouldering peat that offered more smoke than heat. Lady Helena Vance stood before the heavy oak desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. At 29, she had long since learned that showing fear to her father was like bleeding in water filled with sharks, yet the instinct to shiver was born of the bone-deep cold that permeated the house rather than cowardice. She wore a gown of faded grey wool that had been turned and mended so many times the fabric had grown thin and shiny at the elbows. It was a garment fit for a governess or a high-ranking servant, not the daughter of an earl, but in this decaying mausoleum of a home, titles meant little against the crushing weight of debt. The Earl of Braddock sat slumped in his leather chair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. The drink was the only thing of quality left in the house, purchased on credit that had long since run dry. His face was flushed, the capillaries broken across his nose and cheeks, a map of his vices, and his eyes, once sharp, were now glassy and swimming with intoxicated malice. He slammed the glass down, the sound echoing sharply in the cavernous room. "You will do as you are told, Helena," he slurred, the words thick but heavy with threat. "I have not kept you fed and housed all these years for you to develop a spine now. Baron Rooker has been generous, exceedingly generous. He is willing to overlook your age and your lack of freshness." Helena felt the bile rise in her throat. She kept her chin lifted, her brown eyes dark with a defiance she had nurtured in silence for a decade. "Baron Rooker is a monster, father. His first wife died falling down a flight of stairs that had a railing. His second drowned in a pond no deeper than her waist. He is 60 years old, and he smells of rot and cruelty. I will not marry him. I would rather take service in a scullery." The Earl laughed, a harsh grating sound that turned into a wet cough. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Service. You are the daughter of an earl. You have a duty to this name. Do you think I care about your delicate sensibilities? Rooker holds the notes on this house, on the land, on the very chair I sit in. He has offered to burn the debts in exchange for you. It is a transaction, girl, nothing more. I am not a piece of livestock to be bartered to a butcher," Helena said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Sell the paintings. Sell the silver that is left. But do not sell me to a man who will kill me within the year." The Earl's expression darkened, the drunken humour vanishing instantly. He stood up, swaying slightly, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wall. "The paintings are gone. The silver is paste. You are the only asset left with any value, though God knows why Rooker wants a dried-up spinster like you. Perhaps he likes a challenge. Perhaps he likes to break things that think they are strong." He moved around the desk with surprising speed for a man so inebriated. Helena took a step back, but he lunged, gripping her upper arm with fingers that dug into her flesh like iron talons. The pain was sharp and immediate, but she did not cry out. She had learned silence long ago. "You think you have a choice?" he spat, his breath hot and reeking of spirits in her face. "You think you can dictate terms to me in my own house? You are an ungrateful wretch. After everything I have suffered, after the shame you brought on us 10 years ago with that business with the Sterling boy, you owe me this." The mention of the name struck Helena harder than his hand could have. She went rigid, her face draining of colour. "Do not speak of him," she whispered. "You have no right." "I have every right," he roared. He dragged her toward the French doors that led to the stone terrace. The wind battered against the glass, demanding entry. "You will learn obedience, Helena. You will learn that your comfort, your safety, your very existence depends entirely on my good will." "Father, please," she gasped, trying to dig her heels into the threadbare rug. It is a blizzard outside. You cannot. Watch me. He fumbled with the latch, the metal cold and stiff, before throwing the doors open. The storm invaded the room instantly, a chaotic swirl of snow and biting ice that stung the skin. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a heartbeat. With a shove fueled by rage and adrenaline, he pushed her out onto the stone flags. Helena stumbled, the soles of her thin indoor shoes finding no purchase on the slick, icy stone. She fell to her knees, the snow soaking through her skirts instantly. The wind tore at her hair, whipping the honey-coloured strands across her face, blinding her. She scrambled to turn back, reaching for the door handles, but the Earl was faster. He slammed the doors shut, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing like a gunshot through the storm. "Father!" she screamed, pounding on the glass. "Father! Open the door! Please!" Inside, the Earl stared at her, his face distorted by the rippled glass and the condensation beginning to form. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You stay there until you are ready to be a dutiful daughter. A few hours in the cold will freeze that rebellion out of you. When you are ready to sign the contract with Rooker, you may knock." He turned his back on her. Helena watched in horror as he walked back to his desk, picked up the bottle, and poured another glass. He did not look back. He sat down, drinking deeply. And then, as if the exertion had drained the last of his energy, his head lolled back against the leather. Within minutes, he was slumped forward, passed out cold on the desk. Helena continued to pound on the glass, her fists aching, but the wind stole her voice. "He's asleep," she whispered, the realization crashing over her with more violence than the snow. "He's forgotten." She stood there for what felt like an eternity, shivering violently. She wore no cloak, no shawl, only the thin wool dress. The cold was a physical assault, a million tiny needles piercing her skin. She pressed her body against the glass, trying to leach some warmth from the interior. But the fire inside was dying, and the glass was freezing. She watched her father's chest rise and fall in a drunken stupor. He would not wake, not for hours, and in hours she would be dead. The terrace was enclosed by a low stone balustrade, but the steps leading down to the garden were slick with black ice. Helena knew she had to move. If she stayed here, exposed to the full force of the wind coming off the moors, her heart would stop before midnight. She had to reach the stables. The grooms slept in the loft above the tack room. There was a stove there. She forced her stiff limbs to move, navigating the treacherous steps. The snow was already ankle-deep, soaking her stockings and freezing her feet until she could no longer feel her toes. The wind pushed against her, trying to knock her down, a bully of nature joining forces with her father. She kept her head down, shielding her face with her arms, trudging toward the dark outline of the stable block. Every step was a battle. The cold seeped into her bones, making her joints ache with a dull, throbbing pain. She reached the heavy stable doors, her fingers fumbling for the handle. It was locked. Panic, sharp and bright, flared in her chest. Of course. The head groom, a suspicious man who disliked the Earl, locked everything down at dusk to prevent the village lads from stealing tack. She pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but the wind swallowed her cries effortlessly. The walls were thick stone. The men inside, if they were there, would never hear her over the howling gale. She slumped against the rough wood, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Think, Helena," she commanded herself, though her thoughts were becoming sluggish, like syrup pouring in winter. "You cannot stay here." The house was locked. The stables were locked. The only other option was the village. It was 2 miles down the main road, 2 miles in a blizzard without a coat. It was a death sentence, but staying where she was guaranteed death. Moving might offer a slim chance. Perhaps a carriage would pass, perhaps a neighbour. It was madness, but it was the only hope she had. She pushed away from the stable door and began to walk toward the long driveway that led to the main road. The snow was falling harder now, creating a white curtain that obscured the world. The trees lining the drive were like skeletal hands reaching down to snatch at her. She walked, counting her steps to keep her mind focused. 1, 2, 3. The cold was changing now. It no longer felt like pain. It felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her shivering, which had been violent enough to rattle her teeth, began to subside. That was bad. She knew that was bad. She remembered reading somewhere that when the shivering stops, the end is near. A strange sense of calm began to wash over her. She thought of her mother, who had died when Helena was 12, a gentle woman who smelled of lavender and paper. She thought of the library, the smell of old books, the one refuge she had in the world. She reached the iron gates of the estate. They were rusted open, hanging crookedly on their hinges. She stumbled through them onto the King's Road. The ruts in the dirt were frozen solid, treacherous ridges hidden beneath the soft powder. She walked, but her feet felt like heavy blocks of wood that did not belong to her. Just a little further, she murmured, though she did not know where she was going anymore. The village seemed a world away. The darkness was absolute, save for the eerie grey light reflected by the snow. Her knees gave way. She didn't feel the impact. The ground was surprisingly comfortable. She curled onto her side, the snow embracing her immediately. It wasn't cold anymore. It was warm. So warm. She felt a phantom heat spreading through her chest, a cruel trick of a dying brain. She closed her eyes, the roar of the wind fading into a lullaby. She was just going to rest for a moment. Just a moment. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, a sound cut through the wind. Not the shriek of the gale, but the rhythmic, heavy thud of hooves and the jingle of harness bells. A light swept over her, harsh and bright, piercing her eyelids. "Hold!" a deep voice shouted, authoritative and sharp. The vibration of heavy wheels grinding to a halt in the snow reverberated through the ground beneath her cheek. She heard the crunch of boots on the ice, purposeful and fast. "Good God!" the voice said, closer now. "Bring the lantern, Thomas. Quickly." Hands were on her. Strong hands. They turned her over, pulling her out of the snow. The movement jarred her, sending a spike of pain through her frozen limbs that was agonizing enough to drag her back from the edge of the void. She gasped, a ragged, wet sound. The light of a lantern flooded her vision, blinding her. She squinted, trying to make out the face hovering above her. It was a man. He was wearing a heavy greatcoat with a high collar, his hat pulled low against the storm. But she saw his eyes. Blue, intense, piercing blue, like the heart of a flame. She knew those eyes. She had seen them in her dreams and her nightmares for 10 years. "Arthur," she whispered, the name shaping itself on her numb lips more by memory than by will. The man froze. He leaned closer, the lantern light illuminating his features, the sharp jawline, the straight nose, the mouth that was currently set in a grim line. Arthur Sterling, the Duke of Caldover. He looked older, harder than the boy she had known. The softness of youth had been chiseled away, leaving a man who looked like he was carved from the very ice that surrounded them. He stared at her, recognition dawning slowly, warring with disbelief. He took in her honey-coloured hair, now matted with ice, her pale, deathly skin, the thin, grey dress that was clinging to her frame like a shroud. "Helena?" His voice was a mixture of shock and something darker, anger, perhaps, or disdain. "Lady Helena." She tried to answer, to explain, but her jaw locked. Her head lolled back against his arm. Arthur looked up at the coachman who was holding the horses steady. "It is the Braddock girl," he said, his voice flat. "She is freezing to death. What is she doing out here, Your Grace? Dressed like that?" the coachman asked, horrified. "I do not know," Arthur replied, his gaze returning to her face. He looked at her not with tenderness, but with a grim, efficient assessment. He was looking at a problem to be solved, not a woman he had once loved. "And frankly, Thomas, it does not matter at this moment. We cannot leave a dog out in this, let alone a woman." He slipped his arms under her knees and shoulders, lifting her effortlessly. Helena felt the warmth radiating from his heavy wool coat, the smell of sandalwood and cold air clinging to him. It was a scent that broke her heart all over again. "Open the door," Arthur commanded. He carried her to the carriage, the black lacquer gleaming in the lantern light. He didn't speak to her. He didn't offer words of comfort. He handled her with the detached care one might give to a broken piece of furniture found on the roadside. Valuable enough to save, perhaps, but burdensome. As he placed her onto the velvet squabs of the carriage interior, Helena managed to focus her eyes on him one last time. He was looking at her hands, her red, raw, calloused hands that were resting on the fine upholstery. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. "Drive on," he ordered the coachman, climbing in after her and slamming the door, sealing them in together against the night. "Make for the hunting lodge. It is closer than the main estate." Helena let the darkness take her then, the rhythmic rocking of the carriage the last thing she felt, wondering if she had been saved or if she had simply traded one form of purgatory for another. The blizzard raged on outside, indifferent to the twist of fate that had just reunited two souls who had spent a decade trying to forget each other. The carriage lurched forward, carrying her away from the death she had almost found, and toward a man who believed she was the villain of his life story. She was safe from the cold, but as she drifted into unconsciousness, she knew the real storm was only just beginning. Caldover Hunting Lodge, northern England. The first sensation was pain. It was not the sharp, biting agony of the wind that Helena remembered, but a throbbing, burning ache that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. It lived in her fingertips, her toes, and the deep marrow of her bones. She groaned, a low, ragged sound that scraped against her dry throat and tried to shift her weight. Softness engulfed her. It was a sensation so foreign after years of sleeping on a lumpy, straw-filled mattress in the servants' quarters of her father's house, that for a moment she thought she had died. Surely this was the afterlife, a place where the cold could not reach her, and the bed linen smelled of lavender and starch rather than damp wool and mildew. She forced her eyes open. The light in the room was dim, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that had been drawn against the day. A fire crackled in the hearth, not the pitiful smoking pile of peat she was used to, but a roaring blaze of seasoned logs that cast dancing orange shadows across the walls. The room was masculine, appointed in dark mahogany and hunter green. A stag's head mounted above the mantel stared down at her with glass eyes, and shelves lined with leather-bound books covered one wall. She was not dead. She was warm, and that terrified her more than the cold. "You are awake." The voice came from the corner of the room near the window. It was a dry, clinical voice, devoid of warmth. Helena turned her head, wincing as her stiff neck protested the movement. An older man with spectacles perched on the end of a long, aquiline nose was packing instruments into a black leather bag. He looked at her with professional detachment. "I am Dr. Corvus," he stated, snapping the bag shut. "You are fortunate, madam. Another hour in that storm, and you would have lost more than just the sensation in your extremities. As it stands, you have severe chilblains and exhaustion, but your fingers and toes remain attached. Whether they will regain their full utility remains to be seen." Helena stared at him, her mind slowly piecing together the fractured memories, the terrace, the wind, the snow, the carriage. "Where?" She coughed, her voice cracking. "Where am I?" "You are at the hunting lodge of His Grace, the Duke of Caldover," the doctor replied, picking up his hat. "He brought you here 2 days ago. You have been in and out of a fever since then." He moved to the door, his hand pausing on the brass knob. "He is waiting for you to wake. I shall inform him that you are lucid. Do not attempt to leave this bed. Your body has suffered a great shock, and your constitution appears fragile at best." Before she could ask anything else, before she could ask if she was a prisoner, or if her father knew where she was, the doctor slipped out. Helena lay back against the pillows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur. He had brought her here. The memory of his face in the lantern light, hard and unyielding, came flooding back. He had looked at her with such contempt. The Arthur she had known 10 years ago. The young man who used to read poetry to her by the river and promise her the world, was gone. In his place was the Duke, a man of power, wealth, and icy reserve. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a nightgown of fine white cotton, clearly borrowed, perhaps from a housekeeper or a guest room wardrobe. It was soft against her skin, a luxury she hadn't known in a decade. She raised her hands to her face. They were red and swollen, covered in salve, the nails short and broken. Shame washed over her. These were not the hands of a lady. They were the hands of a scullery maid, roughened by lye soap and scrubbing brushes. The door handle turned. Helena stiffened, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin as if it could shield her from the judgment about to walk through the door. Arthur Sterling entered. He was still wearing his riding clothes, dark breeches, polished boots that gleamed in the firelight, and a crisp white shirt beneath a dark waistcoat. He had removed his coat, but the informality did nothing to soften his presence. He seemed to fill the room, sucking the air out of it. He did not smile. He did not rush to her side. He walked to the foot of the bed and stood there, gripping the wooden post with one hand, his knuckles white. "The doctor tells me you will live," he said. His tone was flat, conversational, as if discussing the weather or crop yields. "Yes," Helena whispered. "It seems so." "A pity," he said coldly. "It would have been a more merciful end than whatever drove you into a blizzard dressed in rags." Helena flinched. The insult landed precisely where he intended. "I thank you for your charity, Your Grace. I know it was not given willingly. Charity had nothing to do with it." "Duty did," Arthur retorted, moving from the bed to the fireplace. He stood with his back to the flames, his silhouette dark and imposing. "I could hardly leave the daughter of the Earl of Braddock to become a frozen corpse on the King's Road. The questions would have been tiresome, the scandal inconvenient." He crossed his arms over his chest, his blue eyes locking onto hers with laser intensity. "Now explain yourself. What were you doing? My coachman said you were miles from the manor. No cloak, no carriage. Walking blindly into a storm that was killing livestock in the fields. Were you mad or just stupid?" Helena looked down at the quilt, tracing the stitching with a bandaged finger. She could not tell him the truth. She could not say, "My father tried to sell me to a man who beats women, and when I refused, he threw me out like garbage." If she told him that, Arthur might pity her, and she could survive his hatred. She had survived it for 10 years, but she could not survive his pity. Pity would destroy the last fragments of pride she had held onto while scrubbing floors and darning socks. Furthermore, if Arthur knew the truth, his sense of duty might compel him to intervene legally, and that would bring her father's wrath down upon him. Her father was a vindictive, petty man who knew secrets. She had sacrificed her happiness 10 years ago to protect Arthur's family name. She would not drag him into her sordid reality now. "I went for a walk," she lied, her voice hollow. Arthur let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A walk? In a blizzard?" It was not snowing when I left," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I needed air. The house was stifling. I walked further than I intended, and the storm came upon me so quickly. I lost my way." Arthur stared at her, his expression unreadable. He pushed off the mantle and walked slowly toward the side of the bed. He moved like a predator, circling wounded prey. He stopped just inches from where she lay, looking down at her. "You are a terrible liar, Helena. You always were." He reached out, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to strike her. Instead, he took her left hand, the one resting on top of the coverlet. His grip was firm, almost painful, but his skin was warm. He lifted her hand, exposing the red, raw skin, the calluses on her palm, the small burn mark on her wrist from the oven grate. "Do noble women acquire calluses like these from embroidery?" he asked softly, his voice dangerous. "Do they get burns from pouring tea? Look at you. You are thin as a rail. Your hair is dull. That dress you were wearing was fit for a beggar." He dropped her hand as if it burned him. "You look like a woman who has spent the last 10 years scrubbing floors, not living in the lap of luxury you were so desperate to secure." Helena snatched her hand back, hiding it under the blankets. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and humiliating. "Times have been difficult. My father's investments did not yield what was promised." "Is that what you call it?" Arthur sneered. "I call it justice. You broke my heart, Helena. You stood in my library, looked me in the eye, and told me I was too boring, too safe, too poor for your ambitions. You wanted a golden life. You wanted excitement. It seems you found poverty instead." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in her bones. "Did you spend it all? Did you spend the dote you took with you? Or did your father gamble it away while you watched?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He still believed she had left him for money. He believed the lie she had told him that day to make him let her go. "I cannot marry you, Arthur. You are a second son. I need wealth. I need a title higher than yours." The irony was that he had become a duke 2 years later when his brother died, and she had become a servant in her own home. But she couldn't tell him that. "It does not matter," she said, turning her face away from him. "The past is done. I am grateful for your rescue, Arthur, your grace. But I cannot stay here. My father will be looking for me." "Your father," Arthur said with disgust, "is likely too drunk to know you are missing. And even if he is looking, he will not find you here. The roads are blocked. The snow is 5 feet deep in the drifts. No one is coming in, and no one is going out." Panic flared in Helena's chest. Trapped. She was trapped here with him, in this intimacy, with the ghost of who they used to be haunting every corner. And if the roads were blocked, it meant her father couldn't reach her. But it also meant she couldn't escape before the inevitable confrontation. "I must go," she said, panic rising in her voice. "You do not understand. I cannot be here." "You are going nowhere," Arthur commanded. "The doctor said you are weak. If you step outside that door, you will collapse before you reach the stables." "I don't care," Helena cried out, the desperation breaking through her composure. She threw the covers back. The cold air of the room hit her legs through the thin nightgown. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. "I will walk back if I have to. I will crawl." She put her feet on the floor. Her legs, wasted from days of fever and years of malnutrition, buckled instantly. The floor rushed up to meet her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Strong arms caught her. Arthur had moved with a speed that belied his relaxed posture. He caught her against his chest, one arm around her waist, the other gripping her arm to steady her. The contact was electric. For a moment, time suspended. She was pressed against the crisp linen of his shirt, and she could feel the heat of his body, the solid, unyielding strength of him. The scent of sandalwood and soap filled her senses, overwhelming her with a memory so potent it nearly brought her to her knees again. She looked up, gasping. His face was inches from hers. The anger was still there in his blue eyes, but beneath it there was something else: confusion, shock, and a flash of the hunger that used to consume them both. He was holding her as if she were precious, even as his expression said she was poison. "Let me go," she whispered, though her hands had instinctively clutched the fabric of his waistcoat for balance. Arthur didn't move. He stared down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. He seemed to be fighting a war within himself, the urge to push her away versus the instinct to hold her closer. "You are pathetic," he murmured, but there was no venom in the words this time, only a weary resignation. "You cannot even stand, Helena. How do you propose to walk 2 miles in the snow?" He scooped her up into his arms again, effortlessly, just as he had on the road. But this time, she was awake. She could feel the muscles in his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her side. He carried her back to the bed and deposited her on the mattress, not gently, but not roughly either. He pulled the quilt back over her, tucking it in with aggressive efficiency. "You stay," he ordered, stepping back as if creating a necessary distance for his own safety. "You stay until the snow melts. You stay until the doctor says you can leave without dying on my doorstep. I will not have your death on my conscience. I have enough ghosts in my life without adding you to the collection." He turned on his heel and walked to the door. "Arthur!" she called out, the name slipping out before she could stop it. He paused, his hand on the latch, but he didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, the line of his back rigid. "Why?" she asked softly. "If you hate me so much, why did you bring me inside? Why not leave me at the nearest cottage?" Arthur stood silent for a long moment. The fire crackled, spitting a spark against the grate. When he spoke, his voice was so low she almost missed it. "Because despite everything, Helena, I am not you. I do not discard people when they become inconvenient." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Helena alone in the silence. She sank back into the pillows, the tears she had held back finally spilling over. He thought she was a monster. He thought she was a cold, calculating woman who had discarded him for ambition. And she had to let him believe it, because the truth, that she had loved him enough to destroy herself for him, would hurt him more. She looked at her hands, still throbbing with the returning blood. She was safe for now, warm for now, but outside, the wind was still howling, and she knew that this sanctuary was only a temporary reprieve. The snow would melt, the roads would clear, and when they did, the reality she had run from would come crashing through the gates of Caldover. And this time, Arthur would not be standing there to protect her, or so she thought. But as she drifted back into a restless sleep, the feeling of his arms around her lingered, a ghost of a touch that felt more real than the cold that had nearly claimed her life. She was a prisoner of the winter, and a prisoner of the man she had never stopped loving. And for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. The hours passed in a blur of grey light and silence. A maid, a young girl named Bessie with kind eyes and a nervous disposition, brought her a tray of broth and bread. Helena ate ravenously, her body crying out for nourishment, though her stomach cramped in protest at the sudden influx of food. She tried to question the girl. "Has anyone come? Have you heard news from Braddock Hall?" But Bessie only shook her head, terrified of speaking out of turn. "The master said you're to rest, milady. That's all I know." Left alone again, Helena dragged herself to the window. The world outside was a blank canvas of white. The snow had drifted halfway up the lower panes. It was beautiful and deadly. She pressed her hand against the glass, the cold seeping through. Somewhere out there, her father was waking up. Somewhere out there, he was realizing she was gone. He wouldn't care about her safety, but he would care about his asset. He would care that he had nothing to give Baron Rooker. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather snaked up her spine. If Arthur found out about Rooker, if he found out about the debts, he would see it as confirmation of everything he believed. She is in trouble, and now she is here, looking for a savior. He would think she had planned this. He would think she had thrown herself in his path on purpose. She had to get out. She had to leave before her father arrived. She would wait for nightfall. If she could find boots, a coat, maybe she could make it to the village vicarage. The vicar was a kind man. He might hide her. But as she turned back to the room, her legs gave way again, forcing her to grab the heavy velvet curtains for support. She slid to the floor, gasping for breath. Arthur was right. She was weak, broken. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her forehead on them. "I am sorry, Arthur," she whispered into the empty room. "I am so sorry." Down the hall, in the small study that smelled of tobacco and leather, Arthur Sterling poured himself a glass of brandy. His hand was shaking. He stared into the amber liquid, seeing Helena's face. Gaunt, pale, terrified. He saw the bruises he had glimpsed on her wrists when her sleeves had ridden up. He saw the redness of her hands. "I went for a walk. It was a lie. A clumsy, desperate lie." Arthur downed the brandy in one swallow, the burn grounding him. He walked to the window, staring out at the same white landscape Helena was watching. He had spent 10 years building a fortress around his heart, brick by brick, mortared with anger and cynicism. He had convinced himself that she was a villain, a caricature of greed. But the woman in the guest room didn't look like a villain. She looked like a victim. And that possibility terrified him more than anything else. Because if she was a victim, then his anger was misplaced. And if his anger was misplaced, then he had spent a decade hating the only woman who had ever made him feel alive. He gripped the window frame, the wood groaning under the pressure. "Who did this to you, Helena?" he asked the silence. "And why are you protecting them?" The blizzard raged on, burying the secrets of the past under fresh layers of snow, but inside the lodge, the ice was beginning to crack. And Arthur feared that when it finally broke, the flood would drown them both. Caldover Hunting Lodge, the following week. The snow did not stop. It fell with a relentless, suffocating persistence, piling against the stone walls of the lodge until the windows on the ground floor were half buried in drifts of blinding white. For 7 days, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no London, no Braddock Hall, no debts, and no duties. There was only the lodge, a grand but stifling box of velvet and mahogany, trapping 2 people and their ghosts inside. Helena recovered her strength with a speed born of necessity. The fever broke on the 3rd night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. By the 4th day, the idleness began to gnaw at her sanity. She was accustomed to a life of ceaseless labour, mending linens until her eyes watered, polishing silver until her fingers cramped, managing a household budget that shrank with every bottle of spirits her father consumed. To sit in a guest room, staring at the fire while a maid brought her meals on a silver tray, felt less like a luxury and more like a sin. She felt the weight of every crumb she ate, calculating the cost, feeling the invisible ledger of debt to Arthur Sterling growing heavier with each passing hour. She could not remain a passive invalid. If she was to be a prisoner of the weather, she would at least be a useful one. On the 5th afternoon, while the house lay quiet in the heavy lull that follows the midday meal, Helena ventured out of her room. She moved silently through the corridors, her borrowed slippers making no sound on the runner carpets. She avoided the main drawing room, where she could smell the faint, acrid smoke of Arthur's cheroots, and found herself instead pushing open the heavy double doors of the library. She had expected a sanctuary. What she found was a tragedy. The library at the hunting lodge was a vast, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves that reached the rafters, but it had clearly been neglected for years. Books were piled haphazardly on tables, gathering dust. Maps were unrolled and left to curl at the edges. The categorization was non-existent. Philosophy was jammed next to botany, and priceless first editions were leaning precariously against cheap penny dreadfuls. It was a chaotic reflection of a mind that had stopped caring about order. Helena felt a twitch in her fingers. This was something she could fix. This was something she understood. She began without thinking. She found a step stool and a clean rag left by a negligent housemaid. She started with the section nearest the fireplace, pulling down dusty volumes of history, wiping them clean, and sorting them by era and author. The physical work was grounding. The smell of old paper and leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. For hours, she lost herself in the rhythm of the task: pull, wipe, assess, place. She forgot the blizzard. She forgot her father. She almost forgot the Duke. "I was under the impression that you were bedridden." The voice sliced through the silence like a blade. Helena gasped, nearly dropping a heavy volume of Tacitus. She spun around on the step stool, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. Arthur stood in the doorway. He leaned against the frame with deceptive indolence, his arms crossed over his chest. He was wearing a dark blue morning coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat tied with severe precision. His blue eyes were narrowed, tracking her every movement with a mixture of irritation and suspicion. "Your Grace," Helena breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. I did not hear you approach." Arthur pushed off the doorframe and walked into the room. His steps were slow, deliberate. "Evidently. You seem quite industrious for a woman who was at death's door less than a week ago." He stopped at the table she had been using as a staging area, picking up a stack of books she had already organized. "What are you doing, Helena? Looking for valuables to slip into your pockets?" The insult was sharp, aimed to wound, but this time Helena did not flinch. The familiarity of the books had given her a semblance of her old confidence. "I am earning my keep," she replied, her voice steady. "Since I cannot pay you for the food I eat or the wood I burn, I thought I might offer the only service I am capable of. Your library is a disgrace, Arthur. It is a crime against literature to keep a first edition of Milton wedged under a pile of agricultural journals." Arthur's eyebrows shot up. He looked from the book in his hand to her face, surprised by the spark of defiance. A disgrace. You are a guest, albeit an uninvited one. You are not a librarian. I am not a guest, she corrected him, stepping down from the stool. She placed the volume of Tacitus on the table with a decisive thud. Guests are welcome. I am a burden you are tolerating until the snow melts, and I prefer to be a useful burden. Arthur stared at her. The firelight caught the gold in her hair, which she had pulled back into a severe, practical knot. She was wearing a simple day dress that the housekeeper had found for her, a plain navy wool that was slightly too large in the waist, but she stood with a dignity that made the ill-fitting garment look regal. You always did have a compulsion to organize things, Arthur murmured, a strange note in his voice. He ran a finger along the spine of a book. I remember you reorganized my father's study once, when you were 20. He was furious for a week because he couldn't find his brandy, but he eventually admitted the filing system was superior. He was not furious, Helena said, a small, sad smile touching her lips before she could stop it. He was embarrassed that a young girl understood his accounts better than his steward. For a second, the air between them shifted. The heavy curtain of animosity lifted, revealing a glimpse of the easy, intellectual camaraderie they had once shared. They stood there, surrounded by the smell of dust and leather, not as a duke and a pauper, but as two people who spoke the same language of books and order. Why are you doing this? Arthur asked, his voice dropping, the hostility returning but with less edge. Why scrub dust from old books? You should be resting, plotting your return to society. Or is this part of the performance? The humble, penitent Helena, working her fingers to the bone to show me how much she has changed. Helena stiffened. She turned back to the shelves, presenting her back to him so he wouldn't see the moisture gathering in her eyes. Think what you like. It makes no difference to the books. They need care, regardless of your opinion of the cleaner. She reached up to place a book on a high shelf. As she stretched, the loose sleeve of her dress slipped down, exposing her forearm. Arthur moved before she could react. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and gripped her wrist. His touch was not violent, but it was implacable. What is this? He demanded. Helena tried to yank her arm back, but his fingers were like steel bands. Let go, Arthur. I said, what is this? His voice was low, vibrating with a dangerous intensity. He pulled her arm into the light of the sconce on the wall. There, on the pale skin of her forearm, was a mottled collection of bruises, some yellow and fading, some dark purple and fresh, and below them, a thin, jagged white scar that ran from her wrist halfway to her elbow. It was the mark of a fireplace poker, an accident from 3 years ago when her father had swung it in a drunken rage, aiming for the dog but hitting her instead. Helena stopped fighting. She stood frozen, shame burning through her. She had spent years hiding these marks, wearing long sleeves even in summer, perfecting the art of invisibility. To have them exposed to him, to the man she had wanted to be perfect for, was a humiliation worse than the cold. Arthur stared at the marks. His thumb brushed over the scar, his touch surprisingly gentle, almost reverent in its horror. The cognitive dissonance was crashing through him. He could see it in the rigid set of his jaw. This was not the arm of a pampered, greedy woman who spent her days lounging on silk chaises. This was the arm of someone who lived in a war zone. Did Rooker do this? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. Is that why you ran? No, Helena whispered. She couldn't tell him it was her father. The shame of being the daughter of a monster was too deep. I fell. The cellar stairs at home are steep. I am clumsy. Arthur looked up, locking his gaze with hers. The blue of his eyes was dark, swirling with a storm of emotions she couldn't pass. You are many things, Helena. A liar, perhaps. A heartbreaker, certainly. But you are not clumsy. You have the grace of a dancer. Do not insult my intelligence. He released her wrist slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. He stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes never left her face. He was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, stripping away the overlay of the woman he hated and seeing the stranger standing beneath. You claim you left me for a better prospect, Arthur said, the words coming out slowly, as if he were testing a hypothesis. You told me you wanted a life of ease, a life of wealth, and yet I find you 10 years later, wandering in a blizzard, dressed in rags, with scars on your arms that look like defense wounds. He paused. The narrative does not fit, Helena. The pieces do not align. Life does not always follow a narrative, Your Grace, Helena said, pulling her sleeve down and buttoning the cuff with trembling fingers. Sometimes we make choices, and the consequences are not what we expected. That is all. Is it? Arthur challenged. Or are there chapters of this story you have conveniently omitted? It does not matter, she said, her voice regaining its strength. She picked up the rag again, needing something to do with her hands. I will be gone as soon as the road's clear. You need not worry about my narrative or my scars. They are not your concern. Everything in this house is my concern, Arthur retorted, including the people under my roof. He did not leave. Instead, he walked to the other side of the room, to a large armchair by the fire. He picked up a book from the side table, a volume of political philosophy she had dusted earlier, and sat down. He opened it, but he didn't read. He watched her. Continue, he said, gesturing vaguely at the shelves. If you are determined to work, then work, but do not think I am finished asking questions. For the next 2 hours, a strange, tense truce settled over the library. Helena worked, moving up and down the ladder, organizing the shelves. Arthur sat by the fire, ostensibly reading, but every time she turned, she felt his gaze on her. It was heavy, probing, and relentlessly intense. They spoke little, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the cold vacuum of indifference. It was charged with electricity. Occasionally, Arthur would ask a question, not about her past, but about the books. Where did you put the Dante? Top shelf, third from the left, next to Boccaccio where it belongs. And the treatise on agricultural reform? In the bin for kindling, unless you actually intend to read about crop rotation in 1790. He let out a short, dry chuckle at that. It was a rusty sound, but genuine. You are ruthless, Helena. Disorder is the enemy of thought, she replied, quoting a phrase he had used in a letter to her a lifetime ago. Arthur went still. He looked at her, and for a moment, the years fell away completely. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it all suspended in the air, held up by the memory of a shared mind. I missed this, he said softly. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. The quiet, the order, the conversation. Helena gripped the ladder, her knuckles white. Do not, she whispered. Do not rewrite history, Arthur. You hated me. You have hated me for 10 years. I tried to, he corrected. He stood up, closing the book with a snap. God knows I tried. I wanted to hate you. It would have been so much easier. He walked toward the door, pausing as he passed her. He didn't touch her, but the heat of his body radiated toward her. But hate requires certainty, Helena. And looking at you now, looking at your hands, your scars, your eyes, I am losing my certainty. He left the room, the heavy doors closing with a soft click behind him. Helena remained on the ladder, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. She pressed her forehead against the spine of a leather-bound book, breathing in the scent of dust and time. He was getting too close. He was looking too deep. If he kept pulling at the threads of her lies, the whole tapestry would unravel. And if he found out the truth, that she had saved him, that she loved him, that she had been abused for it, his guilt would destroy him. She had survived the cold of the blizzard. She wasn't sure she could survive the heat of his forgiveness. But as the wind howled outside, sealing them in for another night, Helena realized with a terrifying clarity that she didn't want to leave. For the first time in 10 years, she felt seen. Not as a disappointment, not as a servant, not as a spinster, but as herself. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the roads, burying the world, and locking them together in a dance that neither of them knew how to stop. The isolation was no longer just a circumstance. It was a crucible, and in the heat of it, the truth was beginning to boil to the surface. Caldover Hunting Lodge, 2 days later. The silence that had wrapped the lodge in a protective cocoon was broken not by a shout, but by the dripping of water. The great thaw had begun. The sun, finally piercing through the heavy slate clouds, turned the pristine white drifts into slush. The icicles clinging to the eaves wept onto the stone terrace, a rhythmic drumming that sounded to Helena like a ticking clock. She stood by the window in the library, a leather-bound ledger in her hands, but the numbers blurred before her eyes. The roads were clearing. She could see the black, jagged line of the carriage track emerging from the white expanse of the driveway. The sanctuary was dissolving with the snow. "You have miscalculated the grain yield for the tenants in the north quadrant." Arthur's voice came from the large armchair by the fire. He didn't look up from his own reading, but his tone was devoid of the biting sarcasm that had coloured their interactions a week ago. "I have not," Helena replied, her voice tight. "The yield was low because of the flooding in late August. I adjusted the expected tithe accordingly. Unless you wish to starve your tenants to balance a column of ink." Arthur lowered his book, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. "Merciless," he murmured. "My steward would have simply lied to me to keep me happy." "I am not your steward," Helena said, closing the ledger. "And I have no interest in keeping you happy with lies. You have enough of those in your life." The air between them had shifted in the last few days. It was not friendship, it was too charged, too heavy with the past for that. But it was an understanding. They were two shipwrecks stranded on the same island, finding a strange comfort in the shared wreckage. Helena had spent the nights organising his chaotic library, and Arthur had spent them watching her, offering critiques that evolved into debates on philosophy, land management, and history. But the peace was fragile. A commotion from the entrance hall shattered the quiet. The heavy front doors slammed open with a violence that reverberated through the floorboards. Voices, loud, coarse, and demanding, echoed off the stone walls. "Stand aside, you imbecile. I am the Earl of Braddock, and I will not be barred from a house that harbours my property." Helena dropped the ledger. The sound of the heavy book hitting the floor was like a gunshot. Her face drained of all colour, leaving her as pale as the melting snow outside. Her hands flew to her throat, her breath catching in a strangled gasp. "Father," she whispered. Arthur was on his feet instantly. The relaxed posture of the man reading by the fire vanished, replaced by the rigid tension of a soldier hearing an enemy charge. He looked at Helena, seeing the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes. It was not the fear of a daughter caught disobeying. It was the fear of a prisoner hearing the jailer's keys. "Stay here," Arthur commanded, his voice low and hard. "No!" Helena gasped, backing away from the door. "He will find me. He has brought Rooker. I can hear him. I said, stay here." But it was too late. The heavy double doors of the library were flung open before Arthur could reach them. 3 men stood in the doorway. The Earl of Braddock looked like a man unravelling. His coat was stained with mud, his cravat askew, his face a mask of flushed, drunken fury. Beside him stood Baron Rooker, a man whose wealth could not mask the rot in his soul. Rooker was short, thick-set, with eyes that seemed to strip women naked, and he was smiling, a wet, predatory smile that made Helena's skin crawl. Behind them, the lodge's butler, an elderly man named Henderson, looked flustered and bruised, as if he had been shoved aside. "There she is!" the Earl shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Helena. I told you she would run to him." Arthur stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Helena and the intruders. He did not shout. He did not bluster. He simply stood there, 6 feet and 2 inches of calm, aristocratic menace. "Lord Braddock," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a temperature that froze the room. "And Baron Rooker, to what do I owe the displeasure of this intrusion? I do not recall sending an invitation." "Invitation?" Braddock spat, stepping into the room, leaving muddy tracks on the Persian rug. "You stole my daughter, Caldover. You abducted her in the middle of the night. I rescued a woman freezing to death on the King's Road because her father had locked her out in a blizzard. Arthur corrected, his gaze boring into the Earl. A fact I am sure the local magistrate would find fascinating. Braddock flinched, but Rooker stepped forward, tapping his cane against his boot. A pretty story, Duke. But we know the truth. The girl has a history of flightiness. She ran to you, didn't she? Trying to rekindle an old flame to escape her duty. Rooker's eyes slid past Arthur, landing on Helena. He licked his lips. She looks well enough, a bit thin perhaps, but nothing a few weeks of proper discipline won't fix. Aye. Helena shrank back against the bookshelves, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Rooker spoke of her as if she were a horse he had purchased at a discount. Get out of my house, Arthur said. It wasn't a request. Not without her, Braddock snapped, desperation leaking into his voice. She is my daughter. She is under my legal guardianship until she marries, and she is betrothed to the Baron. We have come to collect her. I am not betrothed, Helena cried out, the words tearing from her throat. I never signed. I never agreed. Your agreement is not required, girl, Braddock roared, lunging past Arthur. Arthur moved to intercept, but Rooker was closer to the flank. The Baron sidestepped the Duke with surprising agility for a heavy man and reached Helena. He grabbed her wrist, the same wrist Arthur had examined days ago, the one bearing the scars of the fireplace poker. Come now, my dear, Rooker purred, his grip crushing. Stop this nonsense. The Duke doesn't want you. You're spoiled goods, old goods. But I'm a generous man. I'm still willing to take you. Helena screamed as he yanked her forward, the pain in her wrist shooting up her arm. Let me go. The sight of Rooker's hand on Helena snapped something inside Arthur. The veneer of civilization, the polite restraint of the peerage, shattered. He didn't just step in. He attacked. Arthur seized Rooker by the collar of his coat and the back of his waistband and hurled him backward. The Baron flew across the room, crashing into a heavy oak reading table before sliding to the floor in a heap of groans and velvet. Braddock froze, his mouth falling open. You struck a peer of the realm. Arthur ignored him. He turned to Helena, who was clutching her wrist to her chest, sobbing silently. He placed a hand on her shoulder, not to restrain her, but to ground her. Are you hurt? She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her eyes wide with shock. Arthur turned back to the two men. Rooker was scrambling to his feet, his face purple with rage. You will pay for that, Sterling, Rooker snarled. I will have you before the House of Lords. I will sue you for alienation of affection. That woman is mine by contract. She is not yours, Arthur said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She is under the employment and protection of the Duchy of Caldover. The room went silent. Even Helena looked up, confused. Employment? Braddock sputtered. Don't be absurd, she is a lady. She does not work. She does now, Arthur lied smoothly, his mind racing to construct the fortress of words that would keep her safe where stone walls could not. Lady Helena has been engaged as the archivist for the Caldover Library. She is cataloguing my family's collection. As such, she resides here as a member of my household staff, entitled to the full protection of my name against harassment. That is a lie, Rooker shouted, spitting blood from a cut lip. It's a farce to cover your lechery. You're keeping her as a mistress. Careful, Baron. Arthur stepped closer, towering over the smaller man. You are standing in my house, accusing a Duke of dishonor. Men have been called to dawn duels for less. Do you wish to test my aim? I assure you, it is far better than your manners. Rooker paled. He looked at Braddock, expecting support, but the Earl was looking at Arthur with dawning horror. Braddock knew he could not win a physical fight, nor a duel, against Arthur Sterling. This isn't over, Braddock hissed, trying to salvage his dignity. You can't hide her behind a fake title forever. The law is on my side. I am her father. He turned to Helena. Get your things, Helena. Now. Or so help me God, I will drag you out by your hair. Helena took a step forward, her conditioning to obey her father fighting against her survival instinct. She looked at Arthur, waiting for him to step aside, waiting for the inevitable moment where social order trumped kindness. Fathers owned daughters. That was the way of the world. But Arthur did not step aside. He reached out and took Helena's hand, not the wrist Rooker had bruised, but her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. He pulled her gently but firmly to his side, creating a united front. "She is not going anywhere," Arthur stated. "She comes with you," Braddock challenged, sneering. "You intend to harbour a fugitive daughter." Arthur looked at the Earl, his blue eyes cold as the ice on the moors. "You misunderstand, Braddock. I am not harbouring her. I am employing her. And if you attempt to touch a member of my household again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and assault. I have 3 footmen in the hall who are very eager to earn a bonus." He tightened his grip on Helena's hand, feeling her trembling subside slightly. He looked straight at the villains and delivered the decree that would seal their fates. "She comes with me. Now get out." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Rooker looked at Arthur, then at the door, calculating his odds. He was a bully, and bullies essentially cowards when faced with superior strength. "You're making a mistake, Caldover," Rooker spat, adjusting his coat. "She's not worth the trouble. She's broken." "That is for me to decide," Arthur replied. "Henderson." The battered butler appeared in the doorway, looking vindicated. "Your Grace, escort these men off the property. If they resist, release the hounds." Braddock's face turned a mottled grey. "You wouldn't. Try me." With a final venomous glare at Helena, Braddock turned and marched out, Rooker limping behind him. The sound of their boots retreating down the hallway was the sweetest sound Helena had ever heard. Then came the slam of the front door, shaking the house one last time. For a long moment, nobody moved. The adrenaline was still coursing through the room, sharp and metallic. Then, Helena's legs gave way. Arthur caught her before she hit the floor. He swung her up into his arms, carrying her over to the armchair he had vacated earlier. He sat her down, kneeling before her, his hands hovering over hers. "Did he hurt you?" Arthur demanded, his voice rough. "Let me see the wrist." Helena held out her arm. A fresh red mark was already blooming where Rooker's fingers had dug in, overlaying the old scars. Arthur stared at it, his jaw working. He looked like he wanted to kill someone. "I am sorry," Helena whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I brought this to your door. I brought this shame upon you." "Shame?" Arthur looked up, his eyes blazing. "You think I feel shame? I feel rage, Helena. Unadulterated rage." He stood up and paced away, running a hand through his dark hair. "Is this what your life has been? Rooker, that swine. My father owes him £4,000, Helena said, the confession pouring out now that the dam had broken. "He sold me to settle the debt. That is why I ran. That is why I was in the snow." Arthur stopped pacing. He turned slowly to face her. "He sold you?" "Yes." "And the dote?" Arthur asked, the question hanging in the air. "The money you supposedly left me for. Where is it?" Helena looked down at her hands. She couldn't tell him yet. Not everything. The sister. The forgery. It was too much. "Gone," she said simply. "It is all gone." Arthur looked at her for a long time. The pieces of the puzzle were rearranging themselves in his mind. The woman he had villainized for a decade was a woman who had been sold by her father to pay debts. The greed he had ascribed to her was actually the greed of the men around her. He walked back to her, crouching down so they were eye level. "You are safe here," he said, his voice fierce. "Do you understand? As long as you are under my roof, they cannot touch you." "They will come back, Arthur," she warned him, her voice trembling. "Rooker is right. The law is with them. You cannot keep me here simply by calling me an archivist. They will bring a magistrate. They will bring a warrant." "Let them come," Arthur said, a dark, dangerous determination settling over his features. "I have resources they can only dream of. I have been fighting bored politicians and corrupt lords in the House of Peers for 10 years. Do you think I cannot handle a drunkard and a lecher?" "But why?" Helena asked, searching his face. "Why risk a scandal for me? You made it clear you despise me." Arthur reached out, his thumb brushing away a tear on her cheek. The touch was electric, shocking them both. "I am finding it increasingly difficult to remember why," he murmured. He pulled his hand back, standing up abruptly as if the intimacy terrified him more than the violence had. "Henderson!" he called out. The butler entered, looking ruffled but triumphant. "Your Grace." "Send a rider to the village. I need a message sent to London immediately, to Mr. Silas Vane, my solicitor. Tell him to come at once, and tell the grooms to prepare the fastest horse." "Yes, Your Grace." Arthur turned back to Helena. "You were right. Physical force is a temporary solution. If they want to use the law, we will use the law. But we will do it my way." "What are you going to do?" Helena asked. "I am going to destroy them," Arthur said calmly. "But first, we need proof. Real proof. Not just of your father's debts, but of everything." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "There is more, isn't there? More than just this debt. There is a reason you let me believe you were a monster for 10 years. Helena looked away, her heart pounding. She was safe from her father, but she was no longer safe from Arthur's scrutiny. "Rest, Helena," Arthur said, his voice softening. "You are the archivist of Caldover now, and the first thing you must learn is that the Duke protects his own." He walked to the window, watching the empty driveway where the carriage had disappeared. The snow was melting, but the real storm was just approaching. He could feel it. But this time, he wasn't standing in it alone, and for the first time in 10 years, the ice around his heart was beginning to thaw, replaced by a fire that demanded justice. "She comes with me," he whispered to the glass, testing the weight of the words. They felt like a vow. And Arthur Sterling was a man who never broke a vow. Caldover Hunting Lodge, late winter, 1824. The departure of Mr. Benedict, Arthur's solicitor, was a clandestine affair carried out under the cover of a pre-dawn greyness. The carriage, stripped of the ducal crest to avoid drawing the eye of curious villagers or Braddock's spies, rolled away down the slush-covered drive, its wheels churning the mud that had replaced the pristine snow. Arthur stood on the stone steps, watching the vehicle disappear into the mist. He had given Benedict a task that would require the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of an executioner. Dissect the last 10 years of the Earl of Braddock's financial history. He needed to know every creditor, every marker, every shadow that hung over Braddock Hall. But more importantly, he needed to know what had happened in 1814, the year the world had broken. "He will find it, you know." Helena's voice came from the doorway behind him. She was wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, hugging her arms against the morning chill. "If there is dirt to be found, my father has left a mountain of it." Arthur turned, the cold air biting at his cheeks. "I am not looking for dirt, Helena. I am looking for the cornerstone. The one brick that, if pulled, brings the whole rotting structure down on top of them." He walked back up the steps, stopping beside her. The proximity was dizzying. A week ago, he would have recoiled from her. Now, the magnetic pull he had spent a decade denying was back, stronger than before, fueled by the confusing mixture of his lingering anger and a new, terrifying protectiveness. "It will take him 2 weeks, perhaps 3, to return from London with certified copies of the bank records," Arthur said, ushering her inside and closing the heavy oak door against the damp. "Until then, we wait. We exist in the eye of the storm." And so began the strangest fortnight of Arthur Sterling's life. The lodge, usually a place of solitary retreat for him, transformed into a world unto itself. The thaw continued outside, the landscape turning from white to a stark, bruised brown of exposed earth and wet heather. But inside, a fragile domesticity took root. It was a domesticity built on a lie, that she was his employee, but it felt dangerously like a truth they were both afraid to voice. Helena took her role as archivist with a seriousness that bordered on religious devotion. She spent her days in the library, her hands now healing, the redness fading to a healthy pale peach, moving deftly among the stacks. She created catalogues, mended bindings, and argued with him over the placement of the philosophical texts. "Hobbes does not belong next to Rousseau," she insisted one evening, standing atop the library ladder, a smudge of dust on her cheek. It is a philosophical argument waiting to happen. They should be separated by at least 2 shelves of poetry. Arthur, looking up from his correspondence at the desk, felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, a sensation that was becoming alarmingly frequent. And I suppose you intend to put Byron between them as a buffer. Byron would only encourage the chaos, she retorted, her eyes sparking with a humour he hadn't seen since they were 20. I shall use Wordsworth. He is dull enough to keep the peace. He watched her descend the ladder, the movement graceful despite the heavy fabric of her dress. He found himself cataloguing her movements just as she catalogued his books. He noticed the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. He noticed how she would pause by the window, staring out at the road with a haunted look that vanished the moment she realized he was watching. She was a woman living with a sword suspended over her head, yet she laughed about book placement. The cognitive dissonance kept him awake at night. The Helena of his memories, the cold, mercenary girl who had shattered him, could not be reconciled with this woman who mended her own stockings by the fire and treated his servants with a gentle courtesy that shamed his own brusque manners. Every day that passed without the return of the solicitor was a day of reprieve, but also a day of mounting tension. The air in the lodge grew thick with unspoken words. They circled each other, drawn together by gravity, but held apart by the ghosts of the past. By the 10th day, the confinement had become stifling. The sun broke through the clouds with a brilliance that promised the coming spring. The roads, though muddy, were passable for horses. You are pacing, Helena observed from her seat by the fire. You have worn a track in the rug that will cost you 50 guineas to replace. Arthur stopped abruptly. He felt like a caged tiger. I need air, real air, not the stale draught of this house. He looked at her. Do you still ride? Or is that another skill you have discarded? Helena's face lit up, a genuine, unguarded expression of longing. I haven't been on a horse in 5 years. My father sold the stables to pay a gambling debt in 19. Then it is time you remembered, Arthur said, the decision made. Go and change. Wear the warmest cloak you can find. I will have the grooms saddle the mares. They are gentle enough for someone out of practice. I was never out of practice, she challenged, rising immediately. I could outride you in 1814, Arthur Sterling, and I suspect I can outride you now. Half an hour later, they were trotting out of the stable yard. Helena was mounted on a chestnut mare named Bess, while Arthur rode his massive black stallion, Obsidian. The air was crisp and cold, filling their lungs with the scent of wet earth and pine needles. For the first mile, they rode in silence, navigating the muddy track that led up toward the high ridges of the estate. Helena rode with an instinctive grace, her body remembering the rhythm of the gait instantly. Her cheeks flushed pink with the cold and the exertion, and her eyes shone. For the first time since he had found her in the snow, she looked young. The lines of worry around her mouth smoothed out. The shadows of fear lifted. They reached the crest of the ridge, where the trees gave way to a sweeping view of the valley below. The land was waking up. Patches of snow still clung to the shadows of the stone walls, but the green was pushing through. Arthur signaled to stop. They reined in the horses, letting the animals blow steam into the chilly air. It is beautiful, Helena whispered, looking out over the patchwork of fields. I had forgotten that the world could look like this. From the windows of Braddock Hall, everything always looked grey. That is because the windows of Braddock Hall have not been cleaned in a century, Arthur said dryly, shifting in his saddle to look at her. No, she said, her voice dropping. It is because when you are trapped, even the sky looks like a ceiling. She turned to him, her expression serious. Thank you, Arthur, for this. I know you are doing it to keep me occupied, to keep me from going mad with the waiting. But it is a gift. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. I am not doing it for you, he lied, though the lie was becoming threadbare. I needed to inspect the perimeter fences. Helena smiled, a sad, knowing thing. You are a terrible liar too, you know. You always were. You wear your honor like a coat that is too heavy for you. But you refuse to take it off. Arthur looked away. focusing on the distant horizon. Honor is a luxury, Helena. One I thought you found too expensive. The mood shifted. The brightness of the ride dimmed, replaced by the familiar weight of their history. Why do you still believe that? Helena asked, urging her horse a step closer to his. After everything you have seen this week, the debts, my father's cruelty, the way I live, why do you still believe I left you for money? If I was a fortune hunter, Arthur, I was a spectacularly incompetent one. I believe what you told me, Arthur said, his voice hardening defensively. I believe the words you said in my library. You are not enough, Arthur. I need more. I need a title. I need security. I said what I had to say to make you let me go, Helena said, her voice trembling. If I had told you the truth, you would have fought for me. You would have thrown away everything to save me, and I could not let you do that. Save you from what? Arthur snapped, turning back to her, his patience fraying. From poverty, from a father who drinks too much. I would have taken you with nothing, Helena. I would have lived in a cottage with you. And what of your sister? The question hung in the cold air, sharp and shocking. Arthur froze. The name of his sister, Lady Genevieve, who had died of consumption 4 years ago, had not passed his lips in a long time. She had been the light of his life, a gentle, fragile soul who had been barely 18 when Helena broke their engagement. What does Genevieve have to do with this? Arthur asked, his voice deadly quiet. Leave the dead out of this, Helena. I cannot, Helena said, tears welling in her eyes. Because she is the reason I left. Arthur stared at her, his mind reeling. That makes no sense. Genevieve adored you. She cried for weeks when you left. My father, Helena began, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. He found out. He found something. A letter. A foolish, innocent letter Genevieve had written to the stablemaster's son. It was nothing, a girl's infatuation. But the language, it could have been twisted. It could have been made to look like an affair. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered that stable boy. He had been dismissed quietly. He had never known why. My father threatened to publish it. Helena continued, her voice breaking. He threatened to take it to the scandal sheets. He said he would ruin her. He said she would never marry, that she would be a pariah, that your family name would be dragged through the mud. The Sterling name would be a laughingstock. Arthur gripped the reins so tight his leather gloves creaked. He blackmailed you. He gave me a choice, she corrected, wiping a tear from her cheek with a gloved hand. He said if I broke the engagement, if I returned my dote to him so he could pay his gambling debts, he would burn the letter. He said if I married you, he would release it on your wedding day. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. You were the second son then, Arthur. You had your honor, your name, and your sister. That was all you had. If I had stayed, he would have destroyed the only things that mattered to you. I couldn't let him destroy Genevieve. She was so good. She didn't deserve that. Arthur sat motionless on his horse. The wind whipped around them, rustling the dry heather, but he couldn't hear it. All he could hear was the sound of his own world rearranging itself. For 10 years, he had told himself a story of a cruel woman who wanted gold more than love. A story that allowed him to hate her, to harden his heart, to become the ruthless, successful duke he was today. But it was a lie. She hadn't left him for ambition. She had left him to save his sister. She had sacrificed her happiness, her future, and her reputation to protect his family. She had walked into a life of misery with that monster of a father so that Genevieve could live in peace. And he had hated her for it. Genevieve, Arthur whispered. She married Lord Holloway. She had 3 happy years before the sickness took her. She died beloved and respected. I know, Helena said softly. I read the announcement in the papers. I cut it out. I was so happy she was safe. A wave of nausea hit Arthur. He remembered the day Helena had left him. He remembered screaming at her, calling her heartless. He remembered the way she had stood there, pale as a ghost, taking every insult, never defending herself. Because to defend herself would have been to reveal the threat. She had taken the blame. She had let him hate her to ensure the threat died. "You let me hate you," he said, his voice cracking. "It wasn't a question. It was the only way," she said. "If you knew the truth, you would have challenged my father. You would have caused the very scandal I was trying to prevent. You had to hate me, Arthur. It was the only way you would let me go without burning the world down." Arthur dismounted. He didn't think about it. He just slid from the saddle, his boots hitting the muddy earth with a heavy thud. He walked over to her horse. Helena looked down at him, frightened by his silence. "Arthur!" He reached up, grabbing her waist. "Get down!" She hesitated, then swung her leg over the saddle, sliding down into his arms. Her feet touched the ground, but he didn't let go. He held her there, his hands gripping her waist, staring down into her face with a look of agony. "You foolish, noble, idiot woman," he groaned. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. "You destroyed yourself," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You spent 10 years in hell. For what? For a name. For a letter. For you," she said, her brown eyes locking onto his blue ones. "For your family. I loved you enough to leave you, Arthur. Can you not understand that? The wall he had built, the fortress of ice and cynicism, didn't just crack, it vaporized. The realization of what she had endured, of the sheer quiet strength it had taken to live as a pariah in her own home while he rose to power hating her. It brought him to his knees, metaphorically and literally. He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in, the scent of cold air, horse and lavender. She was real. She was here. And she was the most honorable person he had ever known. "Forgive me," he murmured against her skin, his voice muffled. "God, Helena, forgive me. I have been blind. I have been so arrogant." Helena stood frozen for a heartbeat, and then her arms came up, wrapping around his shoulders, holding him tight. She let out a sob that she had been holding back for a decade. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, stroking the hair at the nape of his neck. "You didn't know. I should have known," he said, pulling back to look at her, cupping her face in his gloved hands. "I should have known you better. I should have known you couldn't be that cruel. I let my pride blind me." He looked at the scar on her wrist, visible just below her glove. He thought of the bruises. He thought of her father, sitting in that rotting house, drinking brandy bought with the money meant for her dowry. A cold, deadly rage settled in his gut. It was different from the hot anger he had felt toward Rooker. This was the icy, calculated wrath of a duke who had just realized an enemy had tortured his beloved for 10 years. "He will pay," Arthur vowed, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "Your father. He thinks he is safe because he holds a title. But I will dismantle him. I will take everything from him. The house, the land, the name. I will leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back." "Arthur," Helena warned gently. "He is still my father. He ceased to be your father the moment he traded you for a gambling debt," Arthur said firmly. "And he ceased to have any protection from me the moment I learned he used my sister to hurt you." He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I thought I saved you from the snow, Helena. But you saved me first. You saved my family's honor. Now, let me return the favor." He kissed her then. It wasn't a tentative kiss, nor was it a ravishment. It was a desperate, claiming thing, a seal on a promise. It tasted of salt and cold air and 10 years of lost time. Helena melted into him, the last of her defenses crumbling. The man holding her was not just the Duke. He was the boy she had loved, returned to her by the truth. When they finally broke apart, breathless and clinging to each other on the windswept ridge, the world seemed different. The sun was brighter. The wind was less biting. "We should go back," Arthur said, his voice husky. "Benedict will be returning soon. And when he brings those papers, when I have the proof of the forgery and the debts, we will end this." Helena nodded, allowing him to help her back into the saddle. As she gathered the reins, she looked down at him. "You know," she said, a small, tentative smile playing on her lips. I really did rewrite the cataloguing system in your library. Arthur laughed, a true deep sound that startled the horses. He mounted Obsidian in one fluid motion. You can rewrite the whole bloody house if you like, Helena, he said, wheeling the stallion around to face the path home. As long as you never try to leave it again. They rode back down the valley, not as a duke and his employee, but as partners going to war. The waiting was over, the truth was out, and Arthur Sterling had a new mission: to destroy the Earl of Braddock, not for the debts he owed the bank, but for the debt he owed Helena Vance. And that was a debt that could only be paid in ruin. Caldover Hunting Lodge, early March 1824. The waiting was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on the inhabitants of the hunting lodge, even as the spring thaw turned the world outside into a dripping, muddy mess. 3 days had passed since Arthur and Helena had stood on the ridge, their secrets laid bare to the wind. But the final piece of the puzzle, the weapon Arthur needed to sever the Earl of Braddock's hold forever, was still travelling somewhere on the road from London. Arthur Sterling was not a man accustomed to passivity. He paced the length of the library until the sound of his boots on the floorboards seemed to echo the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He spent hours staring at the driveway, watching the shadows lengthen and shorten, his mind playing out a dozen different scenarios of ruin for the man who had dared to sell Helena Vance. Helena, conversely, seemed to have found a strange, quiet centre within the storm. Since the day on the ridge, the tension that had defined her posture for a decade had eased. She no longer flinched when he entered a room. She sat by the fire in the evenings, her hands busy with mending or sorting papers, and when their eyes met, there was no longer fear or shame, but a shared, silent acknowledgement of the truth. They were no longer enemies. They were conspirators. It was late on the fourth evening when the sound finally came. Not the wind, not the rain, but the heavy, rhythmic crunch of carriage wheels on wet gravel. Arthur froze in the act of pouring a glass of wine. He set the decanter down with a sharp clink. Across the room, Helena lowered the book she had been reading, her face paling slightly in the firelight. "He is here," she whispered. Arthur didn't speak. He strode to the hall just as Henderson was unbolting the heavy front door. A gust of damp night air swept in, carrying the scent of wet earth and exhausted horses. Mr. Benedict, Arthur's solicitor, stepped over the threshold. He looked haggard, his grey travelling coat splattered with mud to the collar, his spectacles fogged with the change in temperature. He clutched a black leather portfolio under his arm as if it contained the crown jewels. "Your Grace," Benedict said, bowing stiffly, his voice raspy from the road. "My apologies for the hour. The bridge at Oakhaven was washed out. We had to detour through the mire." "Damn the bridge," Arthur said, ushering him in. "Do you have it?" Benedict patted the leather case. "I believe, Your Grace, that I have enough here to hang a man, metaphorically speaking, of course, though given the severity of the statutes regarding forgery, perhaps literally as well." Arthur felt a savage satisfaction curl in his gut. The library, now. "Henderson, bring food and brandy for Mr. Benedict. He has earned it." They retreated to the sanctuary of the library. Helena hesitated at the door, uncertain if she was meant to be part of this council of war. Arthur turned, extending a hand toward her without hesitation. "Come, Helena. This concerns you more than anyone." She took his hand, her fingers cool but steady, and walked with him into the room where the ghosts of their past were about to be exorcised. Mr. Benedict spread the documents across the large oak desk, the parchment crackling in the silence. There were bank ledgers, copies of promissory notes, and sworn affidavits from clerks who had been bribed or intimidated 10 years prior. "It was a tangled web, Your Grace," Benedict began, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. "The Earl of Braddock was clever, I will give him that. He did not merely borrow money, he invented it." He pushed a piece of paper toward Arthur. It was a promissory note, dated August 1814, for the sum of £10,000, a fortune that could buy a small estate. "Look at the signature," Benedict instructed. Arthur leaned over the desk, the lamplight casting long shadows across his face. He stared at the bottom of the document, There, in a flowing, confident hand, was the signature. William Sterling, Duke of Caldover. It was his father's signature, or at least it was a masterful imitation of it. "My father died in June of 1814, Arthur said, his voice deadly quiet. "This note is dated August." "Precisely," Benedict nodded. "The bank in the city accepted it because the late Duke's death had not yet been fully processed through their rural branches, and the Earl of Braddock vouched for it personally. He claimed it was a private loan agreed upon before your father's passing. He took the money, Your Grace. £10,000 borrowed in the name of a dead man." Arthur felt a wave of nausea. His father had been a man of unimpeachable honour. To have his name used to fund Braddock's gambling addiction was a desecration. "But the bank would have called the loan eventually," Arthur said, looking up. "When the estate was settled, they would have come to me for payment. I never saw this note. I never paid it." "No," Benedict said softly. He turned his gaze to Helena, who was standing by the fireplace, her back rigid. "You did not pay it, Your Grace, because it was paid in full 3 months later, in October 1814. Arthur turned to look at Helena. She was staring into the flames, her profile etched in sorrow. "My dote," she whispered. "My mother's inheritance. £12,000. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. You paid the note. He told me he would go to prison," Helena said, her voice trembling slightly. "He came to me in a panic. He said the bank was asking questions. He said they were going to contact you. If they did, you would know he had forged your father's name. The scandal would have been unimaginable, Arthur. It wouldn't have just been theft. It would have been a betrayal of friendship. Your father trusted him." She turned to face him, tears shimmering in her eyes. "He said, if I didn't help him, he would drag everyone down with him. He would release Genevieve's letter. He would claim your father had been part of a scheme. He was desperate and vicious. So I made a deal." "You gave him your entire inheritance," Arthur said, the horror of it sinking in. "Every penny you had in the world, to cover his crime, to protect my father's name. I went to the bank myself," Helena admitted. "I pretended to be acting on his behalf. I paid the note and burned the original. This," she gestured to the paper on the desk, "this must be the bank's copy." "It is," Benedict confirmed. "And it proves everything. It proves the forgery. And the ledgers prove the repayment came from Miss Vance's personal trust." Arthur looked down at the paper again. He saw the date. October 1814. The same week Helena had broken their engagement. The same week she had stood in this very room, in the main estate, and told him she couldn't marry a second son. She hadn't just sacrificed her love, she had bankrupted herself. She had walked away from him with nothing, literally nothing, to ensure that his family name remained unstained, and his sister's reputation remained intact. She had gone from being an heiress to a pauper in a single afternoon, all to save him from a truth that would have hurt him. The weight of it brought Arthur to his knees. He didn't make a conscious decision to move. His legs simply ceased to support him under the crushing burden of his own guilt. He sank down onto the Persian rug, the document slipping from his fingers to the floor. "Your Grace?" Benedict asked, alarmed, starting to rise. "Leave us," Arthur commanded, his voice a rough croak. "Benedict, get out." The solicitor, sensing the seismic shift in the room, gathered his remaining papers quickly and retreated, closing the heavy doors with a soft click. Arthur remained on his knees. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the floorboards, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For 10 years, he had called her a mercenary. For 10 years, he had thought she loved money more than him. And all the while, she had been living in poverty because she had given all her money to save his father's legacy. "Arthur." Helena's voice was soft, coming closer. There was the rustle of silk, and then she was kneeling in front of him, her hands reaching out to hover near his shoulders. "Please, stand up." "I cannot," he choked out. "I cannot stand in front of you. I am not worthy to stand in the same room as you." He looked up then, his eyes burning with unshed tears, his face twisted in agony. "You paid it. You paid for my father's honor. You paid for my sister's future. You paid with your life, Helena. And I spat on you for it. You didn't know, she said gently, her hands finally cupping his face. Arthur, look at me. You didn't know. I should have seen it, he roared, the self-hatred exploding out of him. I knew you. I knew your soul. How could I let a lie erase everything I knew about you? I let you rot in that house with that monster for 10 years. I let you freeze in the snow. I looked at your hands, your scarred, working hands. And I mocked you. He grabbed her hands, pressing his face into her palms, kissing the calluses, the rough skin, the evidence of her sacrifice. Forgive me, God, Helena. Tell me how to earn your forgiveness. I will spend the rest of my life crawling if I have to. I will burn the world down to make this right. Helena watched him, her heart breaking and healing all at once. She had feared his anger, but she had not anticipated this total devastating humility from a man the world considered untouchable. I forgave you the day I left, she whispered, stroking his dark hair. I did it because I loved you, Arthur. Love doesn't keep a ledger of debts. I saved you because I couldn't bear to see you destroyed, and I would do it again. Even knowing how much it would hurt, I would do it again. Arthur pulled back, looking into her eyes with a fierce, terrifying intensity. You will never have to do it again. I swear to you, Helena, by the graves of my ancestors, you will never suffer again. You will never be cold. You will never be hungry. And you will never ever be alone. He shifted, rising to one knee, but keeping hold of her hands. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He was the Duke of Caldover, one of the most powerful men in England, but in this moment, he was entirely hers. Benedict has the proof, Arthur said, his voice regaining its steel, though his eyes remained wet. We have the forgery. We have the blackmail. We have the financial trail. What will you do? Helena asked, a flicker of fear returning. He is still an earl. The scandal. There will be no scandal for us, Arthur promised. Only for him. I will not bring this to a public court if I can avoid it for your sake. But I will bring it to him. I will lay it out before him. And I will give him a choice. What choice? Arthur's expression hardened into something carved from granite. He can face the crown for forgery, a hanging offence, and see his name destroyed in every paper in London. Or he can sign over everything. The title, the lands, the house, and his guardianship of you. He cannot sign over a title, Helena reminded him. It is entailed. He can abdicate his management of the estate to a trustee due to ill health, Arthur corrected, and he can leave England forever. I will give him passage to the continent and a stipend just large enough to keep him in cheap gin until he drinks himself to death. But he will never set foot on English soil again, and he will never speak your name again. Helena let out a breath she felt she had been holding since 1814. To be free, truly free. To know that her father could no longer hurt her, or sell her, or loom over her life like a dark cloud. And Rooker? She asked. Rooker is a coward, Arthur sneered. Once Braddock falls, Rooker will scatter like a rat. I hold his debts now too. I bought them days ago. If he comes near you, I will foreclose on his estate before he can blink. He stood up then, pulling her up with him. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against his body. The heat of him soaked into her, chasing away the phantom chill of the blizzard. We have the weapon, Helena, Arthur murmured into her hair. Now we just need them to walk into the trap. They will come, Helena said, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Rooker is impatient. And my father is desperate. They will come back with the magistrate. They think they have the law. Let them bring the magistrate, Arthur said grimly. In fact, I hope they do. It is always better to have a witness when you execute a monster. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. But tonight we do not talk of monsters. We have lost 10 years, Helena. I do not wish to lose another hour. He didn't kiss her then, not with passion, but with a gentle reverence, pressing his lips to her forehead. Go to sleep. Rest. You will need your strength. When they come, I want you standing beside me. Not behind me. Beside me. I want him to see that he didn't break you. I want him to see that you are the Duchess of Caldover in everything but name. And the name? Helena asked, a daring hope rising in her chest. Arthur smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached his eyes, chasing away the shadows. The name is the easy part. I intend to rectify that particular error as soon as the ink is dry on your father's exile papers. He walked her to the door of the library, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The storm outside had passed, and the storm inside had broken. What remained was a calm, cold determination. As Helena climbed the stairs to her room, she looked back. Arthur was standing in the doorway of the library, the black portfolio in his hand. He looked like a sentinel. He looked like a king preparing for battle. For 10 years, she had been the one protecting him, moving in the shadows, taking the blows so he wouldn't have to. But now, the roles were reversed. The Lion of Caldover had woken up, and he had found his mate wounded. The roar, when it came, would shake the very foundations of the earth. Helena entered her room and went to the window. The moon was out, illuminating the muddy road leading to the village. She placed her hand on the cold glass. "Come, father," she whispered into the night. "Come and see what you have made." The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the hunter was waiting. Caldover Hunting Lodge, early March 1824. Caldover Hunting Lodge, 1 week later. The snow had finally surrendered. The relentless white blanket that had covered the north of England for weeks had retreated to the highest peaks of the moors, leaving behind a landscape that was raw, wet, and vibrantly alive. Green shoots of crocus and snowdrop were piercing through the black earth in the lodge's garden, stubborn testaments to the fact that winter, no matter how harsh, cannot hold back the spring forever. In the guest bedroom, Lady Helena Vance was packing a trunk. It was a small, battered thing she had found in the attic, and her possessions barely filled half of it. There was the grey dress she had arrived in, now washed and mended. There were the 2 new gowns Arthur had insisted on purchasing for her. And there was a single book, a volume of poetry Arthur had given her yesterday, inscribed simply with the date. She folded the charcoal wool dress with precise, trembling hands. She was free. Her father was currently in Dover, escorted by Arthur's most formidable footman, awaiting the packet boat to Calais. Baron Rooker had liquidated his assets and fled to a cousin's estate in Cornwall to avoid debtor's prison. The legal chains that had bound her for a decade had been shattered by the stroke of a pen and the weight of a duke's fortune. She was free, and she was utterly terrified, because freedom, she was discovering, came with a crushing silence. The crisis was over. The adrenaline had faded, and now the reality of her position settled in. She was a single woman of 29, with no dowry, having spent it all, no family home, having signed it over to trustees, and no reputation to speak of. She could not stay here. Every day she remained at the lodge was a day she encroached on Arthur's charity. He had saved her life. He had spent a fortune to buy her liberty. To ask him to keep her, to linger like a stray cat he had fed, felt like an insult to the dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. He acted out of honour, out of guilt for misjudging her. She would not let his guilt trap him into a marriage he didn't truly want. She snapped the latch of the trunk shut. It sounded like a gavel ending a trial. "I will go to the vicarage first," she whispered to herself, rehearsing the plan. "Vicar Thomas needs a governess for his youngest. It is honest work. I am good at honest work." She picked up the trunk. It was heavy, but she had carried heavier burdens. She walked to the door, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the hallway. The house was quiet. Arthur had been in his study all morning, reviewing the final correspondence from London. She hoped to slip out to the stables, ask a groom for a cart to the village, and be gone before he emerged. A letter of gratitude was already sitting on his desk. It was cowardly, perhaps, but she didn't think she could survive a goodbye. If he looked at her with those intense blue eyes and offered her pity, she would shatter. She made it as far as the vestibule. Going somewhere. The voice was low, calm, and came from the shadow of the archway leading to the drawing room. Helena froze. She turned slowly. Arthur was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't wearing his coat, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a dark waistcoat. He looked rugged, tired, and dangerously handsome. "Arthur," she breathed, tightening her grip on the trunk handle. I did not want to disturb you. You were working." "I was," he agreed, pushing off the doorframe and walking toward her. His steps were slow, deliberate, like a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. "I was reading a letter, a very foolish letter left on my desk by a woman who seems determined to drive me to madness." Helena flushed. "It was not foolish. It was necessary. I cannot stay here, Arthur. It isn't proper." "Proper?" Arthur stopped a few feet from her, raising an eyebrow. "We have lived alone in this house for weeks. We have hunted together. We have destroyed an earl together. I think we passed the point of proper when I carried you out of a snowbank in your night rail." "That was an emergency," Helena argued, lifting her chin. "The emergency is over. You have done more for me than any man has ever done. You gave me my life back. But I cannot live on your benevolence forever. I need to find employment. I need to make my own way." "Employment," Arthur repeated, the word tasting like vinegar in his mouth. He looked at the battered trunk in her hand. "And where, pray tell, does the daughter of the Earl of Braddock intend to find employment? Scrubbing floors, teaching French to merchants' daughters." "If I must," she said fiercely, "there is no shame in labour. I have learned that well enough. Put the trunk down, Helena." "No, I am leaving. I will not be a burden." "I said, put the trunk down." The command roared out of him, echoing off the stone walls. Helena flinched, dropping the trunk. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Arthur closed the distance between them in a single stride. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm, shaking her slightly. "A burden," he hissed, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that scorched her. "Is that what you think you are? After everything? You think you are a burden?" "What else would I be?" she cried, tears springing to her eyes. "You spent £28,000 on me, Arthur. You saved me out of guilt, out of duty, because you felt bad that you hated me for 10 years. I won't be a wife you took because you felt you owed her a debt." Arthur stared at her, his expression shifting from anger to stunned disbelief. Then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Guilt?" he asked. "You think I did this for guilt?" He released her shoulders and stepped back, reaching into his waistcoat pocket. "I kept this," he said, holding up a small object. It was a ring, a sapphire, dark as the midnight ocean, surrounded by diamonds. Helena gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. It was her mother's ring, the ring Arthur had proposed with in 1814, the ring she had returned to him the day she broke his heart. "I threw it into the river," Arthur said softly, looking at the stone. "Or at least I tried to. I walked to the bridge the day you left. I held it over the water. I wanted to hate you so much. I wanted to erase you." He looked up at her. "But I couldn't drop it. My hand wouldn't open. I told myself it was because the stone was valuable. I told myself I was being pragmatic. But that was a lie. I kept it because it was the only piece of you I had left." He took a step closer, taking her left hand in his. "I didn't save you because of guilt, Helena. I didn't destroy your father because of duty. And I certainly didn't spend a fortune because I wanted a housekeeper." He dropped to one knee on the stone floor of the vestibule. The gesture was fluid, natural, as if he had been waiting 10 years to do it again. "I did it because I have loved you since I was 19 years old," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. "I loved you when you were the golden girl of the season. I loved you when I thought you were a heartless mercenary. I hated you, yes, but I never stopped loving you. And I love you now, scarred, proud, stubborn, and magnificent." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just as it had a decade ago. You are not a burden, Helena. You are my breath. You are the only thing in this world that makes sense to me. Do not leave me. Please. I cannot survive losing you a second time. Helena looked down at him, the tears spilling over freely now. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long. The fear of being unwanted, of being used, of being alone, dissolved under the heat of his gaze. You are a fool, Arthur Sterling, she whispered, a watery smile breaking through. You could have had anyone. A young debutante. A princess. I don't want a princess, Arthur said, standing up and pulling her into his arms. I want the woman who was brave enough to walk into a blizzard to save herself. I want you. He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of salt and promises kept. It was a kiss that sealed the cracks in their souls, binding them together, not with contracts or debts, but with the terrifying, beautiful inevitability of true love. Say yes, he murmured against her lips. Yes, Helena breathed. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes. Epilogue. 3 years later, December 1827. The snow had returned to Caldover. It fell in thick, soft flakes, coating the world in silence. But this time, the winter held no terror. Inside the great drawing room of the main estate, not the lodge, but the ducal palace that was now a home, a massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the scene. Helena sat on the rug, surrounded by blocks. She was laughing, her face flushed with warmth and happiness. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, and her hands, though still bearing the faint white scars of her past, were soft and adorned with a sapphire ring. "Higher, Mama! Higher!" The demand came from a small boy with messy dark hair and eyes the colour of warm honey. Helena's eyes. "If we build it higher, William, it will fall," Helena warned, placing another block on the teetering tower. "Let it fall," Arthur's voice came from the doorway. "Then we can build it again." The Duke of Caldover walked into the room. He had just returned from London, snow dusting the shoulders of his greatcoat. He looked at the scene before him. His wife and his 2-year-old son, William, named for the grandfather whose honour Helena had saved, and the look on his face was one of profound peace. He dropped his coat on a chair and joined them on the rug, not caring about the dignity of his breeches. He scooped the boy into his lap, earning a squeal of delight. "Did you bring it?" Helena asked, leaning over to kiss her husband's cheek. "I did," Arthur smiled, pulling a document from his pocket. "The deed to Braddock Hall. The trustees have finally released it. It is yours, Helena, fully and legally, to do with as you wish." Helena took the paper. For a moment she thought of the cold, dark house where she had suffered so much. She thought of the terrace door. She thought of the fear. "Burn it," she said softly. Arthur looked at her. "The deed." "No," she smiled, taking the paper and tossing it onto the fire. "The past. Let the house stand. We will turn it into a school, or an orphanage. Something full of life. But the ownership, the memory of what it was, let that burn." They watched as the paper curled and blackened in the flames, turning into ash that floated up the chimney and out into the snowy night. Arthur wrapped his arm around Helena's waist, pulling her close as their son knocked the tower of blocks down with a triumphant shout. "The storm is gone," Arthur whispered in her ear. "No," Helena corrected him, resting her head on his shoulder and watching the snow fall outside the window. "The storm is still there, Arthur, but we are inside now, and we are warm." The fire crackles, fading into embers, and the image of the happy family lingers in the golden light. Sleep well, dear listener. The story of Helena and Arthur reminds us that the harshest winters often precede the most beautiful springs. It teaches us that true love is not just about passion, but about sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to see the truth beneath the scars. If you are currently walking through your own blizzard, feeling the cold bite of loneliness or despair, remember this: storms do not last forever. There is a shelter waiting for you, perhaps in the arms of a loved one, or perhaps in the quiet strength of your own heart. You are resilient, you are worthy, and like Helena, you have the power to walk out of the darkness and into the light, We hope this story has warmed you tonight. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake with the certainty that you are never truly alone. With love and gratitude, the legends of the Fall Team.